explosive in time.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you would, please allow me to introduce you to one of history's most epic badasses. No, not Sly. Nope, not Arnold. There she is. Florence Nightingale! Born to affluent British parents while on vacation, Florence Nightingale was named after the city of her birth, just like her older sister. In Victorian Britain, the name Florence was unusual. It wouldn't stay that way. At 16, she writes in her diary, "God spoke to me and called me to his service." For a well-bred Victorian lady, nurse was not a profession. It was what happened when you ran out of options. Her family fought the idea, she seized it. After visiting Kaiserswerth near Dusseldorf, a Lutheran deaconess hospital and training school, she fell for the system. Routine, cleanliness, discipline, triage, and even published a short book on her experience there. By 1853, the argument at home had turned into respectable employment. Superintendent of London's Institute for the Care of Sick Gentlewomen in Distressed Circumstances. Budgets, rules, hygiene, staffing, and the daily friction of making charity charitable. In October 1854, Sidney Herbert, the Secretary at War, wrote to Florence Nightingale with an assignment. Go east, take nurses, make the army look less like a machine for shredding its own men. She went. Scutari was the funnel, a vast barracks turned hospital, already choking on casualties shipped in from the major Crimean fights, Alma, Balaclava, Inkerman, and the grinding siege lines beyond. What she found there was overcrowding, neglected hygiene, chronic shortages, and an officer class trained to regard cleaning as a suspiciously French idea. Overworked medical staff, official indifference, and mass infection did the real killing. She started with the dull essentials: food that arrived on time, linen that got washed, filth that got removed, supplies that got inventory, patients who got counted. At night, she moved from bed to bed with a lamp, checking the wounded. Her many patients became her most vocal allies. With them behind her, the doctors and brass who bristled at her reforms found it harder to ignore her. In time, the mortality rate plummeted. Back in Britain, Nightingale learned a brutal lesson about power. Officials skim, then forget. So she stopped arguing in paragraphs and started arguing in pictures. She turned army death records into graphics that could not be politely misread. A so-named rose or polar area plot that showed disease, not bullets, was the dominant shape of the war, month after month. And she used comparative bar charts to show something even more embarrassing. In key age groups, even at home, a soldier's odds looked much worse than a civilian's. A good chart is faster than sympathy and harder to argue with. For higher-ups with saturated schedules, she built evidence with a hook. Look, then fund. Florence Nightingale David was named for Florence Nightingale, a friend of her parents. At University College London, she worked for statistician Carl Pearson, turning the crank of a mechanical calculator, a Brunsviga, to be specific, an estimated 2 million times to build tables of the correlation coefficient, originally published in 1938. In World War II, she traded tables for tactics, tackling ordnance and home security problems for the British state. She continued publishing a statistical primer in 1953 and the more popularly accessible Games, Gods, and Gambling in 1962 with J. Townend. In 1970, she chaired the new statistics department at UC Riverside. Florence the Machine formed in London in 2007, born from Florence Welch and Isabella Summers. Florence Robot and is a Machine, a private joke that escaped into branding. The sound followed: Baroque pop grandeur, cathedral drums, and vocals that don't so much sing as haunt the rafters. At the making of this video, their newest album, Everybody Scream, was released on October 31st, 2025. Halloween, naturally. The founding of Florence and the Machine is closer in time to the life of Florence Nightingale David than it is to their release of Everybody Scream by about 4 years. And we are closer in time to the life of Florence Nightingale than we are to the birth of Florence Nightingale David by 355 days. Florence's David begins as civic recycling, a huge flawed block of Carrara marble abandoned in the cathedral yard for decades after earlier sculptors gave up. In 1501, the Opera of the Duomo handed it to 26-year-old Michelangelo. He carved until 1504. The statue was meant for the cathedral roofline, but standing at over 5 meters, it was too politically useful to hide. An advisory committee, including Leonardo and Botticelli, argued over its placement. The Florentine state ultimately chose the nearby seat of government. Unveiled in September 1504 outside the Palazzo della Signoria, David seemed to embody the Republic itself, tense, watchful, before the fight. Weather and violence followed. The statue was damaged in a riot in 1527 and eventually moved indoors in 1873 to the Accademia. A replica took its place in 1910. The release of Everybody Scream by Florence and the Machine is closer in time to the birth of Florence Nightingale than Florence Nightingale's birth is to the unveiling of David of Florence by 40,251 days. That's a little over 110 years. Florence begins as Florentia, almost as a Roman bet, a rectangular castrum planted in the Arno plain below Etruscan Fiesole. Tradition pins the founding to 59 BC. Many historians and archaeologists instead lean to an Augustan build-out when veterans were settled and the grid was stamped into the mud. Cardo, decumanus, a forum, today's Piazza della Repubblica, still sits at the crossroads. Even the name is policy. Florentia, an auspicious wish, may you flourish. Centuries later, the Renaissance would pretend the city sprang from genius. It didn't, really. It sprang from surveyors, right angles, and a river crossing. The release of Everybody Scream by Florence and the Machine is closer in time to the unveiling of David of Florence than the unveiling of David of Florence is to the original founding of Florence by 1,041 years.